host for this session, and I'm very delighted that all of you have joined us. Before we proceed with the keynote session, let us take a moment to express our gratitude to all the organizers and participants who have made this event possible. This conference serves as a platform for scholars from various disciplines to come together and explore the complex and thought-provoking topic of violence in literature and media. Today, we have the honor of hosting a renowned scholar, Dr. Albrecht Classen, who will be delivering a keynote address on the theme, The Horrors of War and Violence as Reflected in Western Literature and Cinema, Medieval, Early Modern, and Contemporary Perspectives and Transcultural Values Across Time. It is my privilege to introduce our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Classen. Sir is a University Distinguished Professor of German Studies at the University of Arizona, Tucson, and a prolific author in the field of German and European medieval and early modern literature. With an impressive publication record of 124 scholarly books, including recent works such as Wisdom from the European Middle Ages and The Secret in Medieval Literature, Dr. Classen's expertise is widely recognized. He is also the editor of prestigious journals such as Medieval and Humanities Open Access, and serves on numerous boards dedicated to humanities, literature, history, social studies, and art history. Dr. Classen's contributions to academia have been widely acknowledged. In 2004, he received the Order of Merit from the German government and was granted the rank of University Distinguished Professor. He has also been the recipient of 5-Star Faculty Award in 2009 and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching Arizona Professor of the Year Award in 2012. In 2017, he was honored with the rank of Grand Knight Commander of the Most Noble Order of the Three Lions. And in 2022, he was named an honorary member of the American Association of Teachers of German. Not only does Dr. Classen excel in academia, but he also has a passion for creative expression. He is an accomplished poet with 10 volumes of poetry to his name and has authored essays and satires published in 4 volumes. As the president of the Society for Contemporary American Literature in German and an honorary member of the PEN Organization for Writers Abroad, he continues to contribute to the literary world. Dr. Classen's dedication to education extends beyond the university setting. He has led summer study abroad programs in medieval Europe since 2004, providing students with immersive learning experiences. Furthermore, he has made significant contributions to German language education by reaching out to hundreds of high school students studying German in the state of Arizona. Currently, he serves as the president of the Arizona chapter of the American Association of Teachers of German. With such a remarkable profile, we can expect Dr. Classen's keynote address to offer profound insights and stimulate thought-provoking discussions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Classen.
Thank you so much for a very kind introduction. It is a great honor that I'm allowed to address you all today and to reflect on a fundamental issue in human life, literature, the arts, and of course, economic military conditions. Before I proceed, can you hear me well?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
And you can see my PowerPoint well?
Yes, it is visible.
Very good. So it is my great honor that you invited me to serve as your keynote speaker. And for 2 points I would like to emphasize. It seems to me that we have, at least I have, a growing degree of friendship and collegiality with colleagues all across the Indian subcontinent, because I have given many guest lectures and keynote lectures at various Indian conferences. And I'm very, very pleased about building intercultural connections across the disciplines, cultures, languages, and time. So for me, it is a great honor, and I really appreciate that you invited me to address you all. The other point is much more philosophical, and since we are in the fields of humanities, on the one hand, and experience, on the other hand, massive killings and war in the current time, we suddenly might realize once again what the purposes of the humanities are all about, namely to address critical human issues. We and the humanities have a critically important task, namely to address human suffering, happiness, sorrow, and other fundamental issues. So I think the current time to reflect upon war as through the lens of the humanities is extremely important. Maybe that is the one remaining voice addressing human morals, ethics, in a world where all of those ideas have been dismissed. If you think about the war, the Russians against Ukraine, or other many wars that continue to be waged. And if you think about the enormous amount of weapon industry, the military industrial complex that produces more and more sophisticated weapons. So the humanities remain one of those important voices, and I feel greatly honored to be allowed to address this. The third point maybe is also important because I will not address the issue so much from a very contemporary issue, but rather I follow the scientific method of the Heisenberg principle, namely the further removed we are from the object of study, the more objectively can we hopefully address it and analyze it. So I will primarily use older documents that address already that issue because it is a timeless issue or problem, and I hope thereby to gain a solid scholarly perspective that then ultimately can be applied and transferred to our contemporary discourse. So, human history is violence. Unfortunately, human suffering, triumphs, victories, defeats, and tragedies are always associated with wars, have always been connected with wars and the suffering and slaughter and killing. It's almost tragic that the entire history of humankind is determined by this violence. This is not something that was limited to the pre-modern world. The Western world believed, of course, since 1945 that a new period of peace had started, but we ran right away into the Cold War, then right away the Korean War, right away the Vietnam War, and then with many other wars like the Kosovo War in Europe, then the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, the war between Iran and Iraq, the war right now between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the genocide war in Burundi, and many, many other wars between, let's say, Peru and Argentina, and so forth. This is really a tragic situation, but we as humanities scholars are called upon to reflect upon what is happening there and why it happens and how we can address this issue. I need to start, however, with something very recent, with a movie which appeared or was published in 2022, Im Westen nichts Neues, All Quiet on the Western Front. Edward Berger, that's the movie director, won 4 Oscars for that movie in, I think, when was it? In March of this year. A major movie addressing World War I and bringing it forward, fast forward to And this movie has won many, many accolades, and thereby helps me to start my discussion of the topic of war and violence through humanities media, in this case a movie, but it really was based on a novel. I will talk about that in a minute. And I just chose one of these images. You can find online a still picture of the soldiers, young, very, very young men who barely have reached adulthood, if that, and are simply thrown into the bloodbath, and they simply become cannon fodder. So the horror, the sacrifice, the glorious nation, then there's the leaders, but ultimately the millions of victims. This movie was based on a novel, and I will have that in another slide, but it was based on a novel published already in 1929 by a German author, Erich Maria Remarque, who reflected on the consequences or the features of the First World War, when so many new types of weapons had been developed, such as the flamethrower, machine gun, planes, tanks, and others, so that the number of victims was multiplied incredibly. But literature, that's really what we are concerned with, but also music, cinema, or the visual arts serve an extremely important role to address this human suffering during war, because of war, if you think about collateral damages or so. And this phenomenon itself, it seems, cannot be avoided. Human history has been so deeply determined by this experience, by this military approach to handling problems with military means, that it's so deeply entrenched that we probably cannot hope for a peaceful solution in the future. It is always sort of, it seems, it rests within us as human creatures to turn to violence. After all, if you think about the earliest account of murder in the Old Testament, Cain and Abel, Cain slaughtering his own brother. So the beginning of human history is determined by murder. That's really kind of a tragic observation. But the counterposition is that poets, writers, artists have always served as voices, human voices, to combat human suffering. Think about joy, basic ethics, morality, and ultimately human spirituality. So that is the odd situation. The more we will talk about war, the more we also will recognize that there is a silver lining. There is a sort of the spirit behind all that bloodshed, because it suddenly takes us beyond the material dimension of human life into the spiritual dimension. So that's the odd thing. Behind the tragedy rests spirituality, or as Dante, the famous Italian Renaissance poet, or like medieval poet Dante, said, you have to go through inferno, that's hell. You have to rise up through purgatory in order to reach, as he called it, paradiso, the paradise, of course, in a Christian context. So in other words, you have to go down to hell first before you can reach the top. Phenomenon already known by Greek poets as katabasis, namely walking or descending down to hell before you have learned your basic lesson in order to rise up and become truly human. War, as you can see here with these various images, has been a constant feature in human history. I think we would have no chance whatsoever to find a year in all of human history when there had not been some war. The world is large. There are many different peoples, cultures, military units. They have constantly struggled and striven against each other. So at the same time, it might sound a little bit sarcastic, but it is certainly true that the experience of war has often, if not always, led to the creation of some of the greatest artwork, the greatest literature, because the experience of human suffering has forced many of the best writers or artists or composers to turn their attention to this horrible experience and turn it around. So here is a very famous picture on the 3rd of May by Francisco Goya, 1808, French troops shooting the Spanish rebels against, the Napoleonic troops. And so this is one of the most famous picture, reflecting the horrors of war, with a light shedding on this poor victim with his raised hands, and the soldiers mercilessly aiming their guns at him, and they all shoot him down. Here's another one. This is an image depicting the wars between Ottomans and Christians, and this merciless slaughter. Horses are killed, soldiers are killed, massive numbers, as if massive killing is the name of the game of human life. And here I present probably the most famous anti-war painting. That is Picasso, the famous Pablo Picasso, the famous Spanish artist who created this painting called Guernica. Guernica was a little village in northern Spain where the Spanish Air Force, or actually a German Air Force unit, practiced their first bombing raid and committed thereby genocide, and eliminated the entire village. It's an almost abstract painting, but Picasso managed thereby to create an iconic representation of human suffering, namely the suffering of the civil population, of animals, and so forth. This image exists in countless copies all over the world, and so you wonder, why is this picture so popular when war continues in an unabated fashion? Another really important artist a little bit earlier was the German Käthe Kollwitz, and she uses an historical event in Germany, 1525, when the peasants rose up against nobility in the so-called Peasant War, and ultimately they were mercilessly and massively slaughtered, and were then repressed. So this is a charcoal drawing showing all these imprisoned peasants all waiting for execution. So that is from 1908, quite remarkably, just 6 years before the outbreak of the First World War. But at the same time, already then the discussion was raging about the horrors of war and what could be done. So artists, as well as movie directors, as well novelists, were and have always been the critical voice against the war. Another one is, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto. That was the uprising by the Warsaw or Polish Jews against the Nazis in 1944. Then and this is then reflected, for example, in this very famous image by Maurice Menschike's homage to the martyr fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto. I mention this because there is a very important motto which he includes: inter arma silent musae. That means in times of war the muses fall silent. He expresses thereby actually the very opposite position as I just tried to expound, namely saying that once war or weapons gain the upper hand, then poets, composers and writers just have no chance. They can voice all their protests, but they are, in a way, powerless. That's certainly true, but on the other hand, also not true. This is here the drawing, this homage to the martyr fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto, and we regard this as one of the monumental images or icons reflecting on the human suffering. So this is the irony I've already addressed before. The worse the situation might be in wars, in battles, in big slaughters, whatever it might be, genocide and so forth, the artist then comes forward and gives vent to the human suffering. So that is a paradox. And this paradox is that the worst times in human history have brought out some of the best poetry and art. That's really kind of strange, but maybe that's the time, human suffering, when poets find the strongest impetus to address the fundamental issue there. I want to now turn to a very old example, which might be unknown to most of you, but I can only suggest this as a very powerful example. I have employed it countless times in my classes, where I have the opportunity to address a very short poem. It is the oldest poem in the history of German literature, written about 1820, or at least copied down about 820, not 18, 820, the so-called Song of Hildebrand. And my students have always agreed with my reading at the end that here we find, in a nutshell, a most surprising expression of the horrendous consequences of military thinking. So let me take you back very briefly to the cultural context of this poem. In that poem, an older general called Hildebrand encounters another army led by a young general, Hardubrand. In a brief conversation, the older man realizes that the young man is actually his long-lost son, whom he has never met before, because the father, Hildebrand, had to leave, had to go into exile for many different reasons. That's not the point right now. So the father tries to communicate with his son, to share with him that there are family bonds between them. The old man has not learned how to communicate well, and instead of really just talking openly and constructively, he only tries to extend offering of gifts, and the young man rejects those, insists that according to the testimony of sailors, his father has died already a long time ago, and he refuses to communicate further with his opponent. And the old man then realizes that his destiny forces him to fight against his own son. We don't know the outcome, but yet we don't need the outcome of this poem, because there are only three possible solutions. The first option is that the young man will kill the older man because he's young, strong, and so forth. The second option is that the older man, because he's so experienced, such a sturdy and powerful general, will overcome the young man and kill him. Or the third option is that both kill each other, irrespective of the outcome, which is not there. You can see the text that simply ends as a fragment. The outcome is certainly the killing among family members. And there is nothing worse to imagine but a son fighting against his own father, or a father against his own son. And both then pull their swords and draw their swords and start fighting against each other. So that is all we know about this poem. We can only say that it was written in a monastery by two monks, and Christian monks, who were, of course, totally opposed to war and must have drawn on this poem because it addresses fundamental problems in human life that apply so well to us today. You could simply say most wars start as a result of a lack of communication, difference in opinion, and maybe as a result of greed and other sins in human life. And in our case, it's pride, military honor. And so ultimately, there's only death and tragedy. I've used this poem many times to reflect upon the fundamental concerns in human life, namely lack of communication. If I am about to make a quick political reference, why do the Russians have to fight against the Ukraine? What need would they have? Could they not simply have sat down, communicate, and simply reach a compromise before the war actually even started? That's so sad, but we always know that military and political leaders have always allowed personal greed to overwhelm them. So this really old text from about 820, that's now 1,200 years ago, expresses some of the fundamental problems in human life leading to war, namely a lack of communication. Another example deals with the issue of revenge. We know this from throughout times that when people feel insulted or robbed or deprived of privileges or whatever it might be, they turn to revenge. They want to avenge shortcomings and disadvantages or deception and so forth. This is beautifully or horribly well depicted in a heroic epic called the Nibelungenlied, the Song of the Nibelungen, written down about 1200, and probably the most important heroic epic from the history of medieval German literature. This is much too extensive for me to discuss here. And all I need to say, however, is on the left navigation bar or left column, namely, once revenge, the thinking of revenge enters the picture, then there is suddenly no ending and mutual slaughter sets in. And this is ultimately the case in this epic as well. And for that reason, I have called this slide the Armageddon of war. Fast forward to explain, for example, the rise of the Second World War. That has a lot to do with the outcome of the First World War. There are a lot of different reasons why the Second World War started. That's not the issue right now. The point is, however, that the Nazis could use the deeply seated anger amongst the German population about the loss of the First World War, and so revenge, the thinking of revenge, then led to the Second World War, with countless victims, at least about, I think, up to, if you count everyone involved, with about 90 million people having died in the Second World War. utter revenge. You know, the Nazis wanted to gain back what they lost before, then they wanted to get more, and then the others resisted, and so forth and so forth. And so it's a very uncanny correlation between this medieval heroic epic, Nibelungen, and the situation in the 20th century. Actually, you might even go so far as to reflect upon the war of the Russians against the Ukrainians, because there's a lot of ideology behind. For Putin and his generals, the Ukraine is the old Russian fatherland. So they claim Ukraine out of ideological reasons, and they would like to eliminate the Ukrainians altogether. And in the Nibelungenlied, it is a sense of revenge that then ultimately leads to the horrendous slaughter in which virtually everyone dies. I don't go into details. I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A session afterwards. But here a couple of examples. That's 19th century illustrations, at least that one on the left. The right one is from the 14th century. And what happens in the first part is that the protagonist, Siegfried, whom you see here drinking from a well, is murdered from behind, and that then later leads his widow, Kriemhild, to endless efforts to avenge this crime. And she never even cares about all the collateral damage. She even doesn't hesitate to get her own child be killed, because her child is then killed by that very murderer whom you see there on the left. Can she motivate her husband, by then the Hunnish king Etzel or Attila, to fight against the guests that are all Kriemhild's brothers, and that leads then to the utter bloodbath. Another text which dramatically illustrates the horrendous situation of war was formulated by a writer in southern Germany, Heinrich Wittenweiler, who wrote a satire called The Ring. And on the right you see the illustration here with the ring symbolizing the entire world, and the poet presents here stories from the world of peasants who are very easily victims of their emotional responses to all kinds of little conflicts, which at the end of the story very quickly explode into military conflicts, and which then also leads to an Armageddon. Sadly enough, this text has survived only in one manuscript, so obviously no one wanted to hear about this criticism of human failure. But the poet points his finger really at the wound, which he calls ignorance and stupidity, which then ultimately leads to war. That's just one of the major texts. However, it did not have much success, but it addresses very powerfully the experience of war. So in other words, I want to emphasize one more time, and following in many other examples, how much poets throughout time have responded to this human experience of war. The most important humanist was Erasmus of Rotterdam, a major philosopher, philologist, and theologian. He lived from 1466 to 1536, and in his satirical writings, he expressed a very important insight. Let's see whether I have this. Yes, right there. He formulated dulce bellum in expertis. That's in Latin, or you might say dulce bellum in expertis, and translated into English, war is lovely for those who know nothing about it. So what he addressed is most dangerously present also in our own time, when people swagger their arms and pretend that it is a glorious time to enter a war because they have these splendid, wonderful weapons, but the outcome is really only suffering, death, and, if you will, Armageddon. Tragically, of course, that is always the case. Erasmus, well, he reached out to many of his intellectual friends and colleagues and other poets and writers, but and he also appeals to us deeply. But of course, nothing of what he wrote ever achieved anything in concrete terms. No one listened to him. Like, that's the same thing today. No one listens to humanities scholars. No one listens to poets who might express concerns about the dangers of war. But I think the motto that he formulated is really incredibly insightful. Only those who have not experienced war, don't know anything about it, only those people believe that war is a great experience. Everything far away from that, of course. And so tragically, Erasmus lived at a time when the Protestant Reformation emerged and developed or erupted. And that Protestant Reformation caused enormous internecine strife between the Catholics and the Protestants. First of all, in theological terms, but then in political terms, and ultimately in military terms, with many different wars waged throughout the 16th century, because the various princes or kings fought against each other. The Protestant princes wanted to have their own territories. The Catholics tried to defend themselves or to repress the Protestant opponents. This is always one of the major issues. I'm afraid this is also an issue in India, has always been, the conflicts between Hindus and Muslims. I seen once a most powerful movie reflecting this. I think it was called 1948, or was it simply called Earth, reflecting on this issue. Religion, in other words, is one of the major forces that motivates people to turn to violent military measures. Many poets responded to that, but also artists. And so here you see another painting by an anonymous artist, just the civil population then suffering badly, the peasants. So what this artist here shows is how much the military then very quickly lives off the land where they operate and abuse, if not kill, the civil population. It is a fantastic artwork and, of course, horrible in its scene. So the militia or the military, depending on the size and organization, has no qualms whatsoever about collateral damage. So this is an expression of human suffering. Again, the paradox is here that we have a fantastic artwork, but the topic itself is horrible. And this was then subsequently expressed in a major novel, maybe the first real big German novel, which was very much based in certain ways on Spanish, the Spanish book by Cervantes, namely Don Quixote. And in this case, this is also a picaresque novel. It's called Simplicius Simplicissimus. That means the most simple simpleton. And it was published in 1669 in the wake of the 30 Years' War, and reflects on the absurdity and senselessness of the war, the 30 Years' War, showing the life of a young man who is then drawn into the war and becomes, well, partly a victim, partly a perpetrator himself. So war is one of the worst human experiences. But ironically, I can only repeat myself here, it has also then triggered the creation of some of the best artworks and literature. And this is then beautifully expressed by this Baroque poet Andreas Gryphius. You see his dates, who lived through the 30 Years' War and composed some of the best anti-war sonnets. And I just have here on the left the German and the English, on the right the English translation, and I will only focus on the last stanza. So he reflects on the suffering, the destruction, and the burning, killing, and so forth. All the time fresh blood flows through the moat and the city. And then it has been already 18 years since our rivers have been plugged with corpses and flow slowly. So he complains bitterly about the suffering resulting from the war, but then he reaches a really monumental insight and worries, and he says here, what is worse than plague, fire, and famine is that in the cause of war, many people have lost the treasure of their soul. So brutality, crudeness, and killing mentality determine suddenly those who are involved in a war. People who have once killed have no hesitation to kill again. So this is, of course, a philosophical, poetic, moral, ethical statement, and yet I think of timeless value. War destroys more than only cities or armies, it also destroys people's souls. Since then, and I could now go on forever, but it's already 45 minutes or so that I've talked, I need to slowly come to end. I have just simply listed some of the most important literary texts addressing war, both in English, Jonathan Swift, in German, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, in Russian, The Kingdom of God is Within You, in English, Goodbye to All That, in German, The Train Was on Time, the Irish poet James Jones, The Thin Red Line, or the American writer Norman Mailer, Why Are We in Vietnam? So war, oddly enough, has always created some of the best artworks, and I'm wrapping this up now with a poster by the same artist I had started with, Käthe Kollwitz. That's now about 15 years later, and this is one of the most powerful anti-war posters. It says, "Never again war." So 1924, so a very strong protest against World War. World War ended in 1918, so that's now 6 years after the war, and she created this poster as an artistic expression against war. And also coming back to the very beginning, the movie, which just achieved so many accolades in 2022, was based on this novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, Im Westen nichts Neues, by Erich Maria Remarque, 1929, in which, both in the novel as well as in this movie, the senselessness of the war and the endless killing of in war are dramatically addressed, where the young people are just sent to the front, one unit after the other, and they all end in their trenches and are just mowed down as cannon fodder. So sadly enough, however, World War II broke out once again, 1939. Then, as I mentioned, we have all these different wars. It does not seem to end, not today, not tomorrow. And I have one more time Goya, who has presented here a traumatic image of the horrendous slaughter that takes place in war. Has war ended? And my answer simply is no. We can kill more people than ever before with less weapons. We have now not only the warfare with airplanes, now we have the new war with war drones. Has violence ended? No. Now we have actually mass shooting, particularly in the United States. And of course, poets talk about this. Has hatred ended? Again, no. The conflicts in this world are still with us, and they are even worse. Think about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Think about the Russian invasion of the Ukraine 2022. Of course, we need peace more than ever before. But at the same time, it escapes us more than ever before. So I have a little flyer on the top right, damals wie heute, then and well as today. That is an anthology on peace. And that just appeared about 3 months ago. I have a little essay in it. So just in case you're interested in it, of course, it was published in German. So, but I just wanted to point out that the effort to address peace, to fight against war continues. Of course, then when people say, as you can see in the bottom left, peace at any cost cannot be a peace, because in my opinion, and this is now a political statement, I admit, but if the Ukrainians simply were to stop fighting, they would be simply overrun and killed in a genocide by the Russians. So peace is something we all need, we all want. We cannot live without peace, but a peace at all costs is not possible. So I want to end my talk with some positive words. Yes, it's all very negative. Of course, it sounds like war is the all-dominant aspect in all of human existence. But there is, of course, also love, which determines the individual relationships. So we continue to live and we continue to love. We have poets, artists, composers, sculptors who are the strongest voices against war. They are not, of course, really listened to. The military-industrial complex does not care about them, but they have addressed the issue in a most powerful way throughout times. Why is there war? Because there are so many different factors. It's human nature almost: greed, fear, nationalism, racism, religious differences, and the military-industrial complex. I think that is one of the most powerful phenomenon which the former American president Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed on January 17, 1961, just in a last speech before he resigned and turned over the presidency to John F. Kennedy. And he warned us at that time, although he was a general in the Second World War, he warned us about the military-industrial complex. That military-industrial complex is stronger than ever before. And I know this, for example, because in my city where I live, in Tucson, we have this company, Raytheon. They are sort of the world suppliers of missiles, military missiles. So, and they make really a good business. So in conclusion, from the Middle Ages to the present, war has been a major driving force. That cannot be denied, and it seems, if you take a very negative view, the all-determining factor. However, I wanted to address here in this talk that the voices for peace are ever stronger, and I can only hope for an improvement of humanity. Hence, I continue myself to invest in words, both poetic and scholarly. And on that note, I think that's exactly 55 minutes. So I hope that I can leave you all with a little bit of hope, as negative as my talk certainly was. And I thank you all very much for this great opportunity that you gave me so I could address this from a very broad perspective. Thank you so much, and I hope we can continue with our conversations in the near future or right now, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And like your quote on where you said Erasmus says that war is lovely for those who know nothing about it, it really reminded me, like, as a person, I've always looked at art for comfort, for solace, and I have never thought about it being a depiction of something so painful and so horrendous. One of the
Mm,
filmmakers that I'm quite fond of, Jonas Mekas, says that in the end, civilizations will perish because people listen to politicians and not poets. So I was
mhm.
just reminded of that. And so your presentation was very wonderful and very informative. But before we move into the discussion and the question answers bit, I would like to introduce our session chair, who has been here throughout. Sir Dr. Nagendra Kumar is from IIT Roorkee. He is an academic and a scholar with a wealth of expertise at his Oh, yes, with a wealth of expertise. Sir holds a prominent position at the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Roorkee. With a solid academic background and extensive research experience, he has made significant contributions in his discipline. Sir's areas of interest are South Asian literature, culture, Indian writing and diaspora, modern literature, Dalit studies, to name a few. Sir has published over 120 research papers, has successfully guided 14 PhD scholars, and is currently supervising 20 others. He's delivered talks in 4 dozen institutions across 19 countries. Sir has organized several AICTE sponsored courses and workshops on various topics. Dr. Nagendra has trained around 2,000 professionals from industry and academia in the areas of language and management. Now I request Professor Nagendra to take over and lead us into a fruitful discussion. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, first of all, let me take this opportunity to thank our esteemed speaker of the session, Professor Classen. It was really profound uh, hearing you on such a massive topic. The way you presented it in such a short span of time, um, it was a wonderful display of erudite expression, and you try to make sense of this otherwise very vast topic. You spoke on the topic the horrors of war and violence as reflected in Western literature and cinema, medieval, early modern, and contemporary perspectives, and transcultural values across time. Well, you started it very beautifully by putting a slogan: human history is violence. And that set the tone for your entire discourse in the sense you made it clear through different illustrations, both from literature and media, that violence is something which is embedded in our existence. Although there have always been questions, and you also beautifully presented both the sides of it. While on the one hand, violence of any sort, whether physical, psychological, or of any form of violence, is certainly not welcome. But we have also seen that our best comes out in the worst of times, and that is the reason, while you pointed out that the entire human history is nothing but a history of war, a history in which people have always fought for their supremacy, political or otherwise. But then you also pointed out that such violence has given birth to world's best poetry and best artistic pieces. So, in times of war, although the muses fall silent, as you said, but the muses exist nonetheless and
Yes.
they transform the world in their own clever way. We have seen that maybe as poets, as literators, you may not be able to intervene in a bloody war right away, but certainly your writings will prove vital in shaping the mindset of the coming generations. And
Yes.
maybe it might stop the resurgence of something as violent. Let's hope so, as
Yes.
violent in future. So it was a wonderful display of intellectual discourse on such an important topic. You have seen two most violent, societies, one from the birth, another from your profession. We have seen, violence has taken over the brighter side of life, at least in the USA and many such countries where, spurting blood, pumping bullets is something as normal as playing with toys. And that certainly is a cause of worry. But we have seen that violence has always been part of our very existence. One of the earliest instances of an epic, the Sumerian epic, we can make mention of Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
Uh, there as well, we find that the entire story has been narrated through violence. If we think of all the epics that are considered the best artistic creations and presentations uh, of human history, artistically, none of them could be possible without violence. But yes, there have always been two sides to it. Some people believe that violence, some kind of violence, is needed for restoring order and goodness, while the others always fear that this kind of violence may be the second nature of the people and so might poison their minds. Unfortunately, in the modern times, when we look at the movies, we look at the serials, we look at the media, the representation of violence somehow is not as subtle as it used to be in the ancient times. Probably the artistic representation used to penetrate our minds gradually and positively, but the crude display of violence everywhere is, I fear, you know, impacting the young minds in a negative way, and as a result, this kind of violence is not at all good for our civilization. But you rightly pointed out that till we have people like you, till we have people who have been trying to fight this unending, unending war between love and hate, and have been trying to establish love, I guess hope is still there. So thank you so much, Professor Klassen. It was wonderful uh, listening to you. And I guess many of our participants will be having questions for you. So I request them to either write their questions in the chat box so that Javaria can take it one by one for you. I think that will keep the order.
Can I address 2 points very briefly?
Yes, 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 please.
Um, I heard that you are directing up to 22 graduate students. I'm a teacher like you, and all we can do is, as teachers, influence and shape the young minds. We
Certainly,
have no
certainly.
influence on the masses. We can only work with intellectuals. I'm just leading a group of 10 students across Europe, and these are wonderful young people, and I'm working with them, and I'm talking with them about similar topics. And ultimately, the hope is that at least in individual cases, we can achieve a breakthrough. That's the first point. And the other point is, I, as a scholar or poet or whatever, I have no influence on the public, but I can try to practice peace in my personal life. I don't trust any politician who talks big about peace and is a violent person at home. That is the only area where we can directly affect human life. Be peaceful yourself. Only if you begin to be a role model. You remember Gandhi, your great founder. He practiced peace, and we admire him until today. He is quoted all over the world because he practiced peace. That's the only thing we can do in practical terms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions. I will read them out to you, sir, and you can answer them.
Thank
A question from Rajesha is that a lot of Hollywood movies have a lot of violence which is portrayed in them. On an international level, these kind of movies are quite successful, which leads other countries such as India also to mimic the violent style in cinema. How do you think that has an impact on people? Because it's cinema here acts as a powerful media of influencing and spreading this violent culture.
That's a very good question. I think because I have thought about it myself for a long time. And that is the basic question every parent, for example, faces when children watch violent movies or video games. Those video games are extremely violent. They show how easy it is to shoot someone or constantly do mass shooting. So the question, which we cannot answer, is, do those videos have a direct impact? Do those videos or movies lead to mass shooting? I don't know. I mean, I can only say from a very personal perspective, we have a son, and he, of course, loved watching some of these graphic, violent, ridden video games in his youth, but he's a very, very peaceful person. So I don't know, but I only can suspect that we have to be careful in equating this. We cannot simply say watching something violent, which creates a lot of adrenaline. People love to see violence and blood and guts. That does not make them necessarily two violent people. But this is a question for a psychologist, for anthropologists. I don't know. I hate these violent movies because I also believe that they desensitize people, but I wouldn't worry too much because my personal experience tells me that that they're not direct correlations.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, in your opinion, what are the reasons behind the Saudi-Yemeni war?
That's a very powerful and important question, and I'm not sure whether I am qualified to answer in specific terms. I believe, however, that one of the major reasons for wars throughout times have been differences in religion, and in most cases, silly differences. I mean, think about the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. Think about the Protestants versus the Catholics throughout Europe. Think about the Shiites and Sunni fighting between Iraq and Iran. This is religion, and religion has driven people to frenzy, turning off rationality and allowing pure emotions to rule, which hence allows religious leaders to launch wars. So religious arguments that ultimately can be deduced back to greed and power. Religion is abused as an ideology, whatever religion, in order to justify military political maneuvers. And I'm afraid that's the case with Yemen and Saudi Arabia.
Okay, sir. Thank you for answering the question. A participant wants to mention that in your presentation you used a quotation which was human history is based in war. Is there any possibility to change it to human history is a struggle for peace so that we can look at it from a positive perspective?
Thank you. That's, for me, a very constructive question, or rather more an appeal, because we are in the humanities. And I like to think, I cannot really prove that, I'm not a scientist, that everything in the humanities is ultimately directed at analyzing human behavior, motivations, and the more we analyze these things, the more we might be able to dig into the human psyche. And by presenting the human psyche with the consequences of their own actions, maybe we can expose people to the dark side within them. We all have dark sides. We are violence prone as human creatures, unfortunately. But the more we expose that dark side, the more we can control this. It's like emotions. Our emotions easily overwhelm us, and then we turn to violence. But if we understand our emotions and channel those emotions, we move from childhood into adulthood, namely into rational beings. So I totally support this. That is our task as humanities scholars, if any at all, then that is our task, to work toward peace and love. I like that a lot.
Okay. I'll take one last question. This question is not directly related to the topic, but the participant is curious as to, do you think the unrest within one influential individual can lead to a historical war, if that's a possibility?
It's not only a possibility, it is one of the major issues in human history. You have always had charismatic leaders. And let's take a very positive figure, Gandhi, who was able, through his charisma, to influence the masses. Then the counterexample was Adolf Hitler, who was also a very charismatic figure and could thereby manipulate the masses. I strongly recommend that we all study closely the French philosopher Gustave Le Bon, who provided the most influential and insightful study of the masses. And already late in 19th century, provided us with excellent insight into this very strange phenomenon of charismatic leaders who abuse the masses, because people tend to be submissive and they want to follow leaders. We in the humanities, however, try to achieve the very opposite, namely to liberate people from this charismatic influence and allowing individuals to be individuals, and thereby to find the humanistic or human dimension within themselves, which is love. And I think that's the most important final word. Yes, we need to fight for love because that leads to peace and that will ultimately overcome war. That's the only hope we have.
Okay. I would like to ask you a question. It's my personal question on my end. I saw a lot of the pictures and the paintings that you showed us about the representation of war, but back then war was fought with people and was fought with weaponry. Now it is more with AI and it is with viruses. If people were to make art on war now, how do you think it would look, sir?
Well, people, artists create images of war today as well. Now, frankly, it doesn't matter where you live. We all know what the Russians did in Bushta, the suburb of Kiev, the slaughter of the civil population. And already Ukrainian artists are working on this topic. And you don't need to have much sophistication in order to express the horrors of war. You just need to show the one dead human being, the suffering, the dead mother, the dead child, the dead husband, brother, sister, and so forth. The weapons change, the killing doesn't. The quantity changes, but not the quality. And so I think that's what I tried to say in my talk. That's the reason why we can use very early medieval or classical texts and images, Homer, or I heard the word of Gilgamesh. And sometimes even the older the text, the more powerful the reflection on the tragic suffering from military violence. It gives us sort of a certain distance, but we address the same thing over and over again. So maybe
Okay,
one
so
final thought, which is very
yes, sir.
odd. You mentioned drones, for example, and the tragedy we face today is that our killing is done more and more via distance. We don't see the dying anymore. In the Middle Ages, the dying took place directly, person to person. And so there are many more ways in the Middle Ages to end a war because it affected individuals, person against person. Nowadays, it's just robots against robots and the civil population, collateral damage. So that's kind of the danger we face right now. There is no more personal responsibility. Hence, artists, writers, movie directors gain more and more influence. That's also one of the reasons why this new German movie, All Quiet on the Western Front, 2022, has achieved such a huge worldwide success. It hits a raw nerve.
Can we take one last question, sir?
One last question. Yes, please.
Okay, the question is, once war starts, why is it so unpredictable to declare the end of the war? War is always a prolonged event. Why?
Because of the notion of revenge. And revenge, like we know, blood feud is never ending. And we know this from the mafia, for example, and we know it from, let's say, First World War to Second World War, Shiites against Sunnis, Iraq against Iran, Palestinians against Israelis. It's always the sense of revenge. It's greed. No one wants to say enough. No one wants to say, okay, I forgive you. This is sort of some of the most profound religious messages, to say enough. You hurt me, but I forgive you. And that's, however, what we can do on a personal level. Let me give you one little example. When my son maybe hurts me, insults me, causes damage to me, I will maybe probably feel a lot of anger. But my love for my son will always, always rule over everything. So that's exactly where we can work, and that's exactly where poets work. they take us back to the core issue of human existence. That is our personal situation. That's what we can do. And that's where we need and must stop the endless raging of violence.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for answering all the questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to thank both Dr. Nagendra and Professor Classen for spending your afternoon, evening with us and enlightening us on this various horrors that war has for us. There are a couple of more questions, sir, but I think we are up for time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So,
Well, thank you very, very much. Mm-hmm.
That's it. I would like to thank all the participants who have joined us as well. And thank you for your time and your patient listening. I hope the rest of you join the next session as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
I thank
Thank you
the
very
Humanities
much.
for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much. Thanks, Professor Classen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Until the next time when we can meet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.